Welcome to Wealthrise Stories, where clarity meets knowledge, and knowledge becomes financial power.
Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to open a door to a completely different side of industrial history. A story that I'm sure will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the corporate world. When you think of steel, what comes to mind? Probably massive chunks of heavy, solid, cold, lifeless metal. Right? Steel is the symbol of physical strength, of solidity, but also of numbness, of gigantic structures built by humans, yet lacking warmth, lacking life. We talk about a steel heart to describe someone cold and emotionless. But what if I told you that steel, the very metal we associate with hardness and coldness, might actually have a heart? Sounds absurd, maybe even crazy, doesn't it? Could a massive corporation, an endless steel-making machine with thousands of furnaces and millions of tons of iron ore, possess something we usually attribute only to humans, or at least to living beings, a soul? Imagine this for a moment. You're standing in front of one of the largest steel plants in the world, like U.S. Steel, for example. You feel the scorching heat radiating from the blast furnaces, melting metal. The thick, metallic smell mixed with dust and smoke, and the deafening roar of machinery slamming and grinding, the screech of metal being sliced apart, the thunderous blow of steam hammers throwing sparks into the dark like fireworks. It's a chaotic dance of power and temperature, a monumental symbol of numbness, of pure material force. And yet the book we're exploring today dares to challenge all of that. Its title alone stunned me the very first time I saw it. United States Steel, a corporation with a soul. A corporation with a soul. What sounds like some kind of sci-fi fairy tale or a literary metaphor so flowery, it's hard to believe, right? How could a business entity built on profit, structured by law, and run by dry numbers be assigned something as abstract, emotional, and deeply human as a soul? And here's the most shocking part. The book doesn't just ask whether a corporation can have a soul, it declares that U.S. Steel really did have one. One of the company's top leaders during its early days even proudly proclaimed, "We don't just forge steel, we forge the spirit of a new era." U.S. Steel is not just a company, it is the beating heart of a nation. The beating heart of a nation. A statement so bold it borders on unbelievable right. It goes far beyond the limits of a normal business corporation. It evokes imagery of life, of will, of something invisible yet powerful enough to shape an entire country. So how could an industrial giant like U.S. Steel, with its scorching mills and massive metal blocks, be attributed something so abstract and emotional as a soul? Is this just PR exaggeration? Or is there a deeper, more complex truth behind this provocative title? A hidden story about how lifeless iron and steel could become symbols of willpower, resilience, and even an entire culture. In this episode, we're going to peel back the hardened layers of U.S. Steel. We're not just looking at dry numbers or complex charts about production or profit. Instead, we'll dive into the stories of the people who built it, the decisions that shaped it, and the far-reaching impact it had on American society and the world. We'll explore how the coldness of steel was infused with meaning, how it was given a soul that transcended its material value. This isn't just a story about economic history or the rise of a steel empire. It's the story of a soul forged from fire and iron, a soul capable of shaping a nation, influencing millions of lives, and becoming a lasting symbol of progress and human determination. Forget everything you think you know about corporations. Prepare for a completely new perspective, a journey where the line between matter and spirit begins to blur. Are you ready to search for the soul of steel? Let's dive in right now. Look around you. Wherever you are, chances are you're surrounded by something made of steel. The solid structure of the building you're in, the skeletal frame of the dream car you hope to own someday, or even a tiny yet essential component inside the phone you're holding. Steel, a material both rough and refined one that has shaped our world for centuries. It's a symbol of strength, resilience, and the great industrial age. But can something as solid and cold as steel possibly have a soul? And can a massive corporation built from steel and numbers actually have a heart? This is the very question that the book we're diving into today asks and explores in a truly captivating way. United States Steel, a Corporation with a Soul. Written by a sharp and insightful researcher, someone who devoted their life to dissecting the complex mechanisms of industry and its impact on society. This book isn't just a dry chronicle of financial history or production data. It was born at a pivotal moment when the world was witnessing the rise of industrial giants, and the author wanted to look deeper, not just into how they operated, but how they lived. Meaning, how a massive economic entity could deeply influence the social, political, and even psychological fabric of a nation. For me, when I first held United States Steel, a Corporation with a Soul, I didn't just see printed pages. I saw an invitation. An invitation not just to read, but to listen. Not just to analyze data, but to have a conversation. A conversation with the very soul of this corporation. I'm not simply a reader or someone summarizing information. I want to be a translator. Someone who searches for the whispers of the past, the sighs of blazing furnaces, the echoes of millions of lives shaped by U.S. steel. I believe that beneath the surface of financial reports, growth charts, and periods of boom and bust lies a story. A human story. One that we need to uncover. In our modern world, corporations have become entities with power rivaling nations. Google, Apple, Amazon, Tesla. Their names echo through every corner of our lives, from how we communicate, work, and shop, to how we dream about the future. U.S. Steel was once one of those giants shaping an entire era, but we often tend to see them as soulless machines driven only by algorithms, profit, and markets. This is truly dangerous, because when we only see numbers, we miss the bigger picture. We overlook the core values that were built, the ethical conflicts that once tore these organizations apart, and the decisions that changed the fate of thousands, and sometimes of history itself. A corporation, no matter how complex its structure, is not just a machine. It's a collection of the wills, ambitions, fears, and hopes of millions of people. Seeing a corporation as a living entity, one with a birth, childhood, maturity crises, and a legacy, helps us understand more deeply its social responsibilities, its ethical obligations, and the immense power it holds in its hands. It helps us draw valuable lessons for the corporations of the 21st century and for ourselves as we interact with these giants. And that's exactly why, in this video series, we won't simply analyze the book academically. We're embarking on a journey together. A journey across time and space to speak with U.S. Steel. We'll explore its miraculous birth from the boldest visions of the great men of steel. How an idea became an empire. Its golden years when its steel didn't just build bridges and skyscrapers, but built the American dream itself. Its internal and external battles, brutal labor strikes, economic crises, and relentless global competition that either forged or fractured its steel heart. How it adapted, sometimes failed, and the legacy it left behind, not only for the steel industry, but for the entire global business landscape. And most importantly, we'll listen to the silent stories of the people who poured their sweat, tears, and even blood into creating that steel heart, from furnace workers and engineers to top executives. This isn't just a dry history lesson. It's an opportunity to reflect on the nature of power innovation, and more importantly, the nature of humanity in the industrial age, and the lessons that still matter today. So then, are you ready? Join me as we step through the door into the heart of steel and uncover the secrets, the stories, and the soul of one of the greatest corporations in history. We begin right now with Chapter 1. The Birth of a Giant. Don't miss it. Welcome to my channel. Today we're diving deep into a story that isn't just about business, but about the creation of a giant, an icon of American power and ambition, United States Steel. Imagine this: if a massive corporation had a soul, how was that soul formed? What shaped it, and who breathed life into it? Let's open Chapter 1, Born from Fire and Ambition. My friends, we're rewinding time to the late 19th century in the United States, an era famously known as the Gilded Age. This wasn't a peaceful America. It was a nation in its adolescence, pulsing with raw energy and a restless desire to rise. The thunder of the Second Industrial Revolution echoed across the continent. Smokestacks shot up like towering mushrooms, spewing thick black clouds, filled with both hope and exploitation. Cities exploded in growth, transcontinental railroads stitched the East Coast to the West, and the entire infrastructure of a future superpower was being built. And to build all of that, what did America need exactly? Iron and steel. Mountains of iron and steel. It was the blood and muscle of the booming economy, the backbone of every structure, from skyscrapers to great bridges, from locomotives to those endless railroad tracks. The steel market of that time was a brutal battleground where giants clashed and created both staggering wealth and horrifying chaos. Among those steel tycoons, one name cannot be ignored: Andrew Carnegie. A man of steel in every sense, not just by profession, but in spirit. From a poor immigrant boy with nothing, Carnegie rose to become the relentless steel king of America. He embodied the American dream: hard work, relentless innovation, and above all, burning ambition. His company, Carnegie Steel, was an unmatched production machine with a simple but devastatingly effective philosophy: cut costs to the bone. Produce the maximum volume and dominate the market at all costs. Carnegie never hesitated to crush competitors. He was a wolf at the front of the pack, always expanding his territory and strengthening his power. But in a world of giants, there weren't just producers. There were also architects of wealth, people who could see the bigger picture and reshape it. That was J.P. Morgan, a name that echoed across Wall Street, a legend of American finance. Morgan wasn't a producer like Carnegie. He was a financier, a captain of capital, a man who controlled the flow of money itself. He didn't build factories, he built financial empires. Morgan envisioned something else entirely: order. He hated chaos, hated price wars that shredded profits and potential. He wanted consolidation, stability, and a tightly organized economy where tycoons cooperated instead of cannibalizing one another. And then these two forces collided. The relationship between Carnegie and Morgan was rarely peaceful, more often an indirect confrontation. Carnegie wanted unlimited competition, pushing prices as low as possible to eliminate rivals. Morgan wanted peace, urging everyone to join hands and create a stable, mutually beneficial market. The climax came when Carnegie, driven by his aggressive nature, decided to expand into the steel pipe market, a sector heavily invested in by many industrialists aligned with Morgan. This move was seen as a direct declaration of war. If Carnegie Steel jumped in, prices would collapse and countless businesses would teeter on the edge of bankruptcy. This was a life-or-death game, and Morgan knew he had to act. Morgan realized there was only one way to stop the chaos: buy Carnegie Steel. Yes, buy the entire empire of the most ruthless steel tycoon in America. It was a bold, borderline insane idea at the time. It would require an astronomical amount of money, a figure no one had ever imagined before. And so the legendary negotiation began. Morgan approached Carnegie and made an unbelievable offer. Andrew Carnegie, already unimaginably wealthy, eventually agreed to sell his empire for $480 million, a mind-blowing sum in 1901, equivalent to billions today. Think about that money enough to buy an entire small country at the time. But that was only the beginning. Morgan didn't just want Carnegie Steel. He wanted something greater. He wanted to merge Carnegie Steel with a whole network of iron and steel companies, from ore mines and coke plants to finished steel mills, railroads, and shipping fleets. His goal was to create a colossal industrial octopus, controlling every step of steel production, from raw materials to final products. On February 25, 1901, J.P. Morgan completed the merger of all these entities, and the United States Steel Corporation was officially born. With an initial capitalization of $1.4 billion, yes, $1.4 billion in 1901, U.S. Steel wasn't just a new company. It became the first billion-dollar corporation in world history. This was a milestone not just for America, but for the entire world, a signal that a new era of large-scale capitalism had arrived. So how was the soul of U.S. Steel formed? The corporation's DNA was encoded in this very moment of creation. It wasn't built only from iron and steel, but forged from the blazing ambition of Carnegie, who created the most efficient production machine of his time. It was also shaped by Morgan's strategic vision and desire for order, who consolidated chaos into a single unified giant. It was a soul born from consolidation, from the ambition to dominate markets, from a belief in the power of scale and efficiency. U.S. Steel was created not just to generate profit, but to build and control a vital part of America's economic backbone. It became a symbol of a rising nation, an industrial powerhouse reshaping itself and the world. Think about it. A corporate entity of such magnitude, created by the minds and hands of titans like Morgan and Carnegie. Are we looking at greedy men chasing profit, or architects of a new era, laying the foundation for humanity's explosive advancement? That's the origin story. But that's only the beginning of United States Steel's journey, a corporation with a complex, powerful, and controversial soul. In the upcoming chapters, we'll explore how that soul evolved, how it shaped America, and what lessons its history can teach us today. Thank you for listening to Chapter 1. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next fascinating stories. We stepped through the time door to witness the spectacular birth of United States Steel, or U.S. Steel. Then today we're going a bit deeper into the core, the foundation of what I call Chapter 2. The steel skeleton, the immutable principles. You know, a corporation, just like a person, isn't just the sum of its parts or its numbers. It has a personality, a soul. And to understand that soul, we have to look at its skeleton and the principles, the original values that shaped it from the very beginning. These aren't just dry business rules. They're a compass, the lifeblood running through its veins, helping U.S. Steel stand firm and grow through decades of turbulence. Let's flip through each bone of this steel skeleton together. 1. Gary Dinner's cooperation instead of destruction. Let's rewind to the early 20th century. It was the age of industrial tycoons, of ruthless battles for market share. Competition was brutal, prices were in free fall, and the steel industry, already tough as it was, became even more unstable. Big companies constantly trampled over one another, creating oversupply and crushing profits. In the midst of that chaos, a far-sighted figure emerged, a man less famous than Carnegie or Rockefeller, but hugely influential for U.S. Steel Judge Elbert H. Gary, the company's first chairman of the board. Gary understood that if the price war continued, everyone would lose. He believed in a different philosophy: cooperation instead of destructive competition. From that belief, a unique tradition was born, later known in history as the Gary Dinners, informal dinner meetings. Gary invited U.S. Steel's main competitors to his home, or to luxury hotels in New York. In an open atmosphere with no lawyers and no secretaries taking notes, they discussed market conditions, ways to stabilize prices, and shared problems of the industry. The goal wasn't to collude and rig the market, though this would become highly controversial later, but to create a more stable business environment where companies could coexist and grow. Can you imagine how radical that idea was at the time? When eating your rivals alive was the norm, Gary suggested bringing them all to the dinner table. This was a bold principle that showed his desire to build a stronger industry from within, rather than chasing short-term profits for his own company alone. It helped define an important part of U.S. Steel's personality, a powerful giant that also saw itself as playing a role in the broader industrial ecosystem. 2. The safety-first philosophy. Next, let's move to a dimension that always leaves a deep impression on me, a powerful example that even a massive steel corporation can carry within it a real concern for people: the safety-first philosophy. In the early 20th century, steel mills were like industrial hellscapes. The roar of machinery blistering heat, gigantic steel beams moving overhead, and gruesome workplace accidents were almost normal, the accepted price of industrial progress. People treated it as something inevitable. But once again, U.S. Steel under Gary and other leaders saw things differently. They refused to accept accidents as fate. In 1908, U.S. Steel launched a revolutionary campaign, Safety First. This was not just an empty slogan, it was a real commitment. The company invested millions of dollars, a staggering amount at the time, into research, new protective equipment, better work processes, and most importantly, into changing the culture of the entire organization. They created safety committees, mandated training programs, and even imposed penalties on those who violated safety rules. U.S. Steel's engineers studied every type of accident, analyzed root causes, and designed preventive solutions. And the result? Within just a few years, the rate of fatal and serious injuries dropped dramatically. Thousands of lives were saved. Tens of thousands of workers were spared from permanent disability. Safety first wasn't only a moral obligation. It became a symbol of leadership, of putting human life first, even in a high-risk industry. To me, this is one of the most crucial pieces of U.S. Steel's soul. It shows that even the largest corporations can and must carry social responsibility, not just to shareholders, but to the workers who sweat and bleed to build the empire. 3. Commitment to quality and innovation. Of course, when we talk about a steel corporation, we can't ignore the core principle, a commitment to quality and innovation in steel production. This is the breath, the beating heart of U.S. Steel. When U.S. Steel was created, its goal wasn't just to produce the most steel, but to produce the best steel. In a time of explosive construction, from great bridges and towering skyscrapers to railways and industrial machinery, steel quality was a matter of life and death. One weak beam could spell disaster. So U.S. Steel poured massive resources into research and development. They constantly explored and improved production processes, from Bessemer converters and Siemens Martin open hearth furnaces to more advanced rolling technologies. They kept tight control over every step in the production chain, from iron ore mining to final finished steel. U.S. Steel's steel became a standard. Customers knew that when they bought from U.S. Steel, they were buying reliability, durability, and superior quality. That reputation didn't just build the brand, it pushed the entire industry forward. When a big boy like U.S. Steel sets a high bar, everyone else has to step up just to keep pace. This principle reflects the company's long-term vision to build a legacy of engineering and quality, rather than just chasing short-term profits. Innovation wasn't only about better products. It was about better ways of making them more efficient, safer, and more sustainable. It was the brain behind the steel skeleton, helping it adapt and grow over time. 4. A complex relationship with the government and antitrust laws. Finally, we can't skip one of the most challenging and defining aspects of U.S. Steel's history, its complex relationship with the government and antitrust regulation. With its enormous scale controlling more than 60% of U.S. steel production, at its founding, U.S. Steel immediately drew attention from the government and the public, who worried about monopoly power. Those Gary dinners we talked about earlier, however well-intentioned, were also criticized as collusion and potential violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Throughout its early years, U.S. Steel faced multiple investigations and notably a long antitrust lawsuit filed by the U.S. government in 1911. The case dragged on for nearly a decade and ultimately reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 1920. The court's ruling became a major milestone. U.S. Steel was not broken up into smaller companies. The court argued that although U.S. Steel was very large, it had not engaged in illegal monopolistic behavior with clear intent to restrain trade. That decision set an important precedent in American antitrust law. Even so, the relationship remained tense. U.S. Steel had to constantly prove that its size did not harm competition and that its scale actually benefited the broader economy. This forced the corporation to be more transparent and to think carefully about its social responsibilities and market impact. It created a continuing pressure that shaped how U.S. Steel made decisions, from pricing strategies to expansion plans. What does this story teach us? That even the most powerful corporations cannot stand above the law, and that a corporation's soul is always subject to scrutiny from society and the state. This relationship became an integral part of U.S. Steel's skeleton, defining its boundaries and responsibilities throughout its history. So we've explored the foundational principles that shaped U.S. Steel in its early years, from Gary's cooperative vision to the safety revolution, to an unwavering commitment to quality and innovation, and finally, to its complex dance with government power. These aren't just business principles. They are the steel skeleton, a solid structure that formed the personality and soul of U.S. Steel. They are the foundation upon which the stories of growth, struggle, and lasting legacy were built. In the next chapter, we'll start adding flesh to this skeleton. We'll look at how U.S. Steel actually operated in practice, how it helped shape America itself, and how these principles were tested over time. Thank you for listening and for joining me on this fascinating journey. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in Chapter 3. Welcome back to our journey through United States Steel, a mighty corporation with a soul. If Chapter 1 was about the brain, the grand vision of J.P. Morgan, and Chapter 2 was about the steel muscles, the colossal scale of the empire, then today we'll go deeper into what I believe is the true soul of United States Steel, thousands of human hearts. The title, Chapter 3, Heartbeats of Thousands, isn't just a poetic metaphor. It truly captures the essence of what we're about to explore. This is the bloodstream, the vital energy flowing through the veins of a massive corporation, from the workers sweating on scorching factory floors to the people who spent their entire lives bound to it. We won't just look at the great achievements. We'll also touch the conflicts, the internal struggles that shape this complex relationship. Let's begin. Imagine a world where the house you live in, the school your children attend, the store where you buy your groceries, even the church where you pray, are all built, owned, and operated by a single entity, the company. That was the reality of U.S. Steel's company towns. As the corporation expanded, especially into remote regions, it needed a stable workforce. And what was the most effective way to keep workers close? Build an entire community. U.S. Steel didn't hesitate to invest in social infrastructure. They built decent homes, sometimes even with electricity and running water luxuries in many places at the time. They opened schools so workers' children could get an education, hospitals to care for the sick, and even recreational clubs, libraries, and churches. Sounds like a paradise, doesn't it? Cradle to adulthood safety net. But the truth was far more complicated. In these company towns, the corporation wasn't just the employer. It was the landlord, the store owner, and in many ways, the local government. This concentration of power created a system of paternalism that was sometimes comforting, but often suffocating. Workers were frequently paid in company scrip, spendable only at the company store, where prices were sometimes higher than the market. Their private lives and personal choices were closely monitored. Freedom of speech, especially talk of forming unions, was harshly suppressed. I often wonder, how did those workers feel living in company-provided homes, buying food from company stores, sending their children to company schools? Was it a safety worth sacrificing some freedom for, or was it a gilded cage? Even so, it's undeniable that for many, these towns built a strong sense of community. They lived side by side, worked together, shared hardships and joy. A powerful, invisible bond formed, creating a unique identity, the identity of U.S. Steel people. But the heartbeat wasn't always steady, wasn't always peaceful. Beneath the surface of order and paternalism simmered a fire of discontent, harsh working conditions, and a yearning for dignity. This is where the corporation's soul revealed its deepest scars. Steel mills were incredibly dangerous workplaces. Blistering heat, colossal machines, and constant accidents were part of daily life. Low wages, long hours, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, were not unusual. Human endurance has limits. It was in this setting that voices rose from the ground, culminating in historic strikes, most notably the steel strike of 1919. Hundreds of thousands of workers across America walked off the job demanding better wages, reasonable hours, and above all, the right to unionize. U.S. Steel under Albert Gary fiercely opposed unions. The company used every tactic available, replacing strikers, calling in the military, launching aggressive propaganda campaigns to break the strike. The struggle dragged on for months, filled with violence, fear, and desperation. Thousands of families faced hunger and the threat of losing their homes. This wasn't just an economic battle. It was the voice of people who wanted fair treatment, decent pay, safe working conditions, and a say in their own fate. These workers weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for future generations, for something far more fundamental: human dignity. It took decades of brutal conflict and countless sacrifices before union rights were widely recognized. This was a scar, a painful but necessary lesson in the story of U.S. Steel, showing that a soul, no matter how well-intentioned, can cause suffering when power goes unchecked. And yet, even amid conflict, another powerful bond persisted: loyalty and devotion. Working in a steel mill wasn't just a job. For many, it was a way of life, a tradition, a part of their identity. It wasn't rare to find families where fathers' sons and even grandsons all worked for U.S. Steel. They passed down not just a family name, but skills, experience, and pride in the craft. A father didn't just teach his son how to operate a machine. He taught him the rhythm of the work, the dangers, the camaraderie. It was like master blacksmiths passing their secrets from one generation to the next. Why such deep attachment? Part of it was stability. In uncertain economic times, U.S. Steel's sheer size provided relatively dependable jobs. Another part was pride. Working with steel, transforming raw iron into the structures that built a nation, was something to be proud of. These were the people who created the bridges, the skyscrapers, the ships, and cars. They were the backbone of an industrial civilization. And perhaps most importantly, it was the sense of belonging. The steelworker community, despite internal tensions, was a tight-knit one. They shared a language, stories, scars, and dreams. People said steel flowed in their veins, and I think that metaphor is entirely accurate. And speaking of hearts, we can't ignore the incredible diversity of them. U.S. Steel was not just a steel mill. It was a cultural melting pot, a destination for millions of immigrants coming to America, seeking a better life. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, huge waves of immigrants from Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia, Italy, Ireland, and African Americans migrating from the South poured into the steel mills. They arrived with little money, unable to speak English, but carried within them immense physical strength, relentless work ethic, and burning dreams. Life wasn't easy. They faced language barriers, discrimination, and were often assigned the hardest, most dangerous jobs. They lived in cramped neighborhoods, keeping their cultural traditions alive, creating vibrant ethnic enclaves. I can imagine dinner tables filled with unfamiliar dishes, folk songs echoing after exhausting shifts, and stories told in a dozen different languages. But this cultural blend created a rich tapestry, a formidable synergy. Each group brought unique skills, habits, and perspectives. They learned to work together despite differences. They created a shared factory language, a distinctive labor culture forged in fire and steel. This diversity formed a resilient workforce that allowed U.S. Steel to operate on an unprecedented scale and helped build the powerful America we know today. So, Chapter 3, Heartbeats of Thousands, isn't just about people working hard. It's about resilience, conflict, reconciliation, and a community forged not only by steel, but by lived experience. The relationship between U.S. Steel and its workers is a quintessential example of the complexity of industrial capitalism, where social welfare efforts intertwine with control, where fierce battles for rights coexist with deep loyalty, and where diversity becomes an endless source of strength. The book, United States Steel. A corporation with a soul doesn't shy away from either the light or the shadows of this relationship. It shows us that these people, with all their hopes, fears, and dreams, were the true soul of U.S. Steel. They were the ones who turned J.P. Morgan's vision into reality, who poured their sweat and blood into building the empire. Their heartbeat still echoes through the history of American industry. In the next chapter, we'll widen our perspective to see how a giant like U.S. Steel helped shape an entire nation, its role in war, economic development, and the forging of America's identity. Thank you, and I'll see you in Chapter 4. Welcome back to our series on the mesmerizing book, United States Steel, a Corporation with a Soul. If in the previous chapters we explored the majestic birth and the early personality traits of this giant corporation, then today we're stepping into a very different phase. A phase I often imagine as a gigantic forge where the soul of U.S. Steel is pushed to its absolute limits. This is Chapter 4, Trial by Fire, a soul in the storm of war and crisis. The 20th century, my friends, was anything but calm. It was a relentless storm of historic upheavals, and no one, no individual, no institution could remain untouched. For U.S. Steel, a corporation born in the blaze of rapid industrialization, these trials were not just tests of production capacity or financial strength, but of its very nature, of the core values that had shaped it. In other words, this was the moment when its soul had to face real fire. Let's turn back the clock to the years when the world was engulfed in smoke and flames. World War I and II. The arsenal of democracy, when the first shots rang out in Europe, and the world was pulled into the vortex of World War I weaves. Steel was not entirely prepared, but the war created an enormous, unprecedented demand for steel. From the railways ferrying soldiers, to artillery shells, to the massive warships crossing the oceans, everything needed steel. And U.S. Steel answered the call. They weren't just a supplier. They became part of the circulatory system of the war effort. Every ton of steel leaving the furnaces wasn't just a product, it was a promise, a piece of national resolve. For the first time, U.S. Steel's role transcended profit and brushed up against the boundary of patriotic duty. But if World War I was a strong wind, then World War II was a full-blown hurricane. Picture it, a global war spanning continents, demanding a mind-boggling amount of resources and production. President Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, and U.S. Steel was one of the most important shelves in that arsenal. I often think about the people working non-stop in those steel mills. They weren't the ones holding rifles on the front lines, but every plate they rolled, every beam they forged, was going into ships, tanks, and planes that would defend the free world. U.S. Steel's plants ran at full capacity day and night without rest. Output soared, and despite tremendous pressure, they fulfilled their mission. In those years, the soul of U.S. Steel was shaped by patriotism, by a sense of grand purpose, and by the unity of hundreds of thousands of people working toward the same goal. They weren't just selling steel. They were helping to shape the future. But every war must end. And after the peak of victory, an even harsher trial awaited not the thunder of artillery, but the deadly silence of a collapsing economy, the Great Depression. From its wartime role as a production hero, U.S. Steel suddenly plunged into an economic abyss that no one had seen before. Demand for steel collapsed. Construction projects came to a halt. The auto industry stalled. The same U.S. Steel plants that had once run at full tilt now sat quiet and empty. This was when the corporation's soul was tested in a different way: survival. They had to make excruciating decisions, choices no leader ever wants to face. Massive layoffs of workers who had stood by them for years. Wage cuts, benefit cuts, hours reduced to the bare minimum. I can only imagine the pain of those workers of families who depended on those modest paychecks. In its struggle to survive, U.S. Steel paid a price, not only in financial terms, but in social terms as well. The reputation and image of a corporation once seen as a pillar of America was shaken. And yet, what's worth noting is that even in such brutal conditions, U.S. Steel still tried to maintain some welfare programs, however small, to support unemployed workers. They did not completely abandon their own people. Perhaps that was a glimpse of the soul we've been talking about, a faint but real awareness of social responsibility, even as they themselves stood at the edge of the cliff. This period also saw the powerful rise of labor unions. Relations between management and workers at U.S. Steel grew more tense than ever. The corporation was forced to adapt, to negotiate, to accept a new reality of workers' rights. It was a major turning point that reshaped how U.S. Steel would operate for decades to come. After the Great Depression and World War II, it seemed U.S. Steel was poised to enter a new golden age. America stood alone as the great power whose homeland had not been devastated by war. The world's reconstruction needs were enormous. And once again, U.S. Steel benefited from this. But that picture didn't last forever. As European countries and Japan began to recover, they didn't just rebuild, they rebuilt more efficiently. With new technology, modern plants, and lower labor costs, foreign steel producers quickly became formidable competitors. U.S. Steel, once the undisputed champion, suddenly felt competitive pressure like never before. American steel, once the gold standard, sometimes became more expensive or less competitive than imports. This was another trial for the corporation's soul. From a position of dominance, it now had to learn to live in a globalized world. The question was, would the confidence that built it turn into complacency? Were they flexible enough to change? Or would they become trapped in past glory? And so, looking back over this entire journey, we can see a clear shift in what we might call the mood of U.S. Steel. In the early chapters, U.S. Steel carries an air of invincibility. It is the symbol of American industrial might, massive in scale, enormous, in assets radiating a confidence that borders on arrogance. There is a belief that it can dictate the market, that it is untouchable. But through the storms of the 20th century, that mood gradually changes. From solid self-confidence, we begin to sense an undercurrent of anxiety. Anxiety about competition, anxiety about the labor market, anxiety about the future of heavy industry itself. The steel soul that once felt as unshakable as a fortress wall now feels cracks forming, not because it has become weak, but because the world around it has changed too fast. The pressure to innovate, to be flexible, to re-examine itself grows heavier and heavier. This doesn't mean U.S. Steel has lost its soul. Rather, that soul has been tempered, sharpened, and sometimes wounded. It has become more complex, more multidimensional. It carries not only the pride of victory, but also the pain of loss and the worry of unprecedented challenges. This Chapter 4, Trial by Fire, shows us clearly that even the mightiest corporation cannot stand forever on brute strength alone. Its soul has been tested in the flames of war, in the cold of economic collapse, and in the heat of global competition. And what's the result? A more complex, more mature, but also more vulnerable entity. The question now is, can U.S. Steel find a way to redefine its soul in a world that won't stop changing? Will it have the strength to overcome the trials still to come? That will be the story of the chapters ahead. Thank you for listening and reflecting with me on this stormy journey of a steel corporation that helped shape a piece of history. See you in the next part. Welcome back to my channel. In the previous chapter, we dug into the dramatic formation of U.S. Steel, a massive steel corporation and a symbol of breakneck industrial growth in America. We saw how J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and other steel barons built an empire whose scale was almost unimaginable at the time. But can a giant corporation born from the merger of other steel titans, a pure economic machine designed to maximize profit, really have a soul? Or is that just a nice phrase, a clever PR shell to cover up the cold nature of capitalism? That's exactly the question we're going to explore in Chapter 5, Beyond the Mill. Responsibility to society. Today, we're not just looking at what U.S. Steel did inside the mill, but how it shaped the communities around the mills, how it treated its employees, and the early, still clumsy steps it took toward recognizing and trying to lessen its impact on the environment. Let's open these pages of history together and see whether we can find the soul of a corporation in the bricks, the roads, and the policies it helped build. 1. Building communities. Not just steel, but lives. Imagine this: you're an immigrant worker or a farmer who's just left the fields to look for a better life in the industrial age. You arrive in a strange place, dominated by towering factories, belching smoke into the sky. You need a place to live. Your kids need a school. And when someone gets sick, you need a hospital. Who's going to provide all that? In many cases, it was the very company that hired you. U.S. Steel, with its scale and influence, didn't just build mills. It built lives. From industrial zones around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Lorain, Ohio, and especially Gary, Indiana, which we'll talk about in more detail later, the corporation poured heavy investment into social infrastructure for its communities. This wasn't pure charity. It was also a practical and very effective strategy. They needed workers, and to attract and retain skilled labor, they had to create a stable, desirable living environment. A community with good schools, modern hospitals, and other public amenities would be an ideal place for workers to settle down, which in turn reduced turnover and increased productivity. They built schools with impressive architectural designs, rivaling public buildings in big cities. These schools didn't just teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. They also promoted civic values and helped Americanize waves of new immigrants. Then there were the hospital's luxuries in many rural areas, at the time funded and built by U.S. Steel, providing essential health care to workers and their families. And of course, there were public libraries where local residents could access knowledge, recreation, and personal development. From my personal perspective, this is a fascinating and thought-provoking dimension. Was this also a form of subtle control where the corporation didn't just control work, but also the social lives of its workers? Possibly. But regardless of the underlying motives, the result was that essential services were provided, services that significantly improved the quality of life for thousands of people in an era before the modern welfare state. U.S. Steel effectively played the role of a mini-government delivering services we take for granted today. 2. Pioneering welfare decisions with a heart. Next, let's step inside the factory gates and offices of U.S. Steel, where internal policies were being shaped. In the early 20th century, the idea of corporate welfare was still very primitive. Most companies simply paid wages, and that was that. But U.S. Steel took steps we'd now call pioneering. They established pension and social welfare programs for workers almost unheard of for a large corporation at the time. Remember, this was decades before the Federal Social Security Act in the U.S. A worker who devoted a lifetime to the mill could feel some peace of mind knowing there would be a pension waiting in old age rather than being abandoned with nothing. On top of that, U.S. Steel introduced workplace accident insurance, an extremely serious issue in dangerous steel mills. Instead of leaving workers entirely on their own to bear the risks of injury, the corporation offered compensation, medical support, and even benefits for families of workers who were killed on the job. This helped reduce the financial burden on workers and reflected at least some level of responsibility from the employer. They also provided low-cost housing programs, and in some cases, company stores with controlled prices to ensure workers could buy basic necessities at reasonable cost, though this company store model also had a dark side and later became the center of much controversy. From a modern standpoint, we can clearly see the limitations of these programs. They can't compare to today's comprehensive benefit packages. But in the historical context of that era, they were genuinely groundbreaking. They show that U.S. Steel wasn't thinking only about immediate profit, but also about a stable long-term workforce and communities with less social unrest. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize everything. Working conditions were still harsh, accidents still happened, and later union struggles make it clear that these policies, however progressive, weren't enough to erase injustice. But the fact that a giant corporation voluntarily chose to move ahead of its time in caring for its workers is definitely a sign of some kind of soul. A spark of corporate conscience, whether driven from the bottom up or the top down. 3. Environmental impact. The dark side and early efforts. Now let's face a less glamorous truth. We can't talk about a steel giant without talking about its environmental footprint. Steelmaking is a dirty business, extremely dirty. In the early 20th century, steel mills were massive machines belching thick, black smoke, spewing coal dust and dumping chemical-laced wastewater into rivers and lakes with almost no treatment. Given its enormous scale, U.S. Steel was undeniably a major polluter of air and water. The skies over Pittsburgh, the Steel City, were often permanently gray with industrial smog. Rivers were discolored and choked with industrial waste. This wasn't just an aesthetic issue. It was a threat to public health and local ecosystems. This is the dark side of industrialization, the unavoidable trade-off between economic progress and environmental degradation. And in an era when environmental awareness barely existed, most companies gave little thought to these issues. Environmental law was essentially non-existent. So was U.S. Steel completely indifferent? Not entirely. While their actions fall far short of modern environmental standards, there were early efforts worth noting. The corporation began installing crude filters to reduce particulate emissions from smokestacks, though the effectiveness was limited. They also invested in research to develop cleaner, more efficient production processes, a long and costly journey. Some plants built settling ponds to allow sludge to sink before wastewater was discharged, or sought ways to reuse certain byproducts. Although these efforts were often driven more by efficiency and cost-saving goals than ecological concern, and they still mark the first steps toward recognizing that industrial activity affected the environment around it. I don't think we can fairly judge them by today's standards in a world facing a climate crisis. But we can recognize that they started to think about these issues, however modestly and reactively. A corporation's soul isn't about perfection. It's about being able to recognize its own impact and trying to improve even when there's a long way to go. This reminds us that environmental responsibility is a concept that has evolved over time and continues to do so. 4. City building, the story of Gary, Indiana. And here's where everything truly comes together. The story of Gary, Indiana. Not every corporation gets or dares to take the chance to build a city from scratch, but U.S. Steel did. Gary wasn't just a steel plant. It was an industrial city planned and constructed by U.S. Steel to serve its massive mills. In 1906, a remote stretch of swampy land along Lake Michigan was chosen as the site for the largest and most advanced steel mill in the world. Alongside the plant, U.S. Steel drew up a master plan for a model city. They didn't just erect towering industrial structures, they designed a complete urban system. Broad avenues, green parks, central squares, churches, schools, hospitals, libraries, and thousands of homes for workers and their families. Gary was living proof of U.S. Steel's power and ambition, not just as an economic giant, but as a social architect. The city was named after Albert H. Gary, the founding chairman of U.S. Steel, and it was designed to be an ideal place for workers, a city from steel to steel, built of steel, and for the people who made it. This careful planning aimed to create a stable, safe, and attractive living environment that encouraged workers to stay loyal. It reflected a holistic vision, not just of producing steel, but of building a solid social foundation to support that production. However, for that very reason, Gary also became a symbol of both the dazzling successes and the serious challenges of the company town model. While it offered comfort and stability at the beginning, the city's heavy dependence on a single industry and a single corporation created long-term vulnerabilities when the steel industry began to decline decades later. From my perspective, Gary is a powerful example of just how far a corporation's vision can extend, not just to the next quarter's sales figures, but to the building of an entire miniature civilization. That says something about being soulful, about the ability to see the bigger picture and the will to shape it. So after all this, does U.S. Steel really have a soul? I don't think the answer is a simple yes or no. Through building schools, hospitals, and libraries, through pioneering pensions and welfare programs, through the earliest limited attempts to address environmental impact, and through creating an entire city like Gary, Indiana, we can see that U.S. Steel reached beyond pure profit. It showed a notable degree of social and community responsibility, especially when viewed in the context of its time. Its motives were likely a complex mix of genuine goodwill and enlightened self-interest. They wanted to attract and retain talent, create a stable environment for business, and sometimes simply craft a positive public image. But regardless of how mixed those motives were, the outcome was that thousands of people benefited from infrastructure and welfare policies they might never have had without U.S. Steel's involvement. It was a complicated blend of hard-edged capitalism and social responsibility, what we might call the corporate soul of that era. The big takeaway is that corporate social responsibility is not just an optional add-on or a PR exercise. For a corporation with the scale and influence of U.S. Steel, it was a core part of how it existed and shaped the world around it. And the legacies, good and bad, of those decisions still echo today. Thank you for spending time with me exploring this fascinating, complex side of U.S. Steel. I hope this chapter has given you a deeper sense of what it means for a corporation to have a soul in its historical context. In the next chapter, we'll dig deeper into the internal challenges U.S. Steel faced: the labor wars, the rise of unions, and the power and justice struggles inside an industrial empire. There are definitely plenty of surprises and drama ahead. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming episodes. See you in the next chapter. In the previous chapters, we explored the origins, the colossal scale, and the core values that U.S. Steel built over time. But have you ever wondered, how can such a gigantic entity with hundreds of thousands of people working across scattered mills and offices manage to maintain a single vision, a shared culture, and one unified soul? How does that soul not only exist, but actually communicate? That is the focus of today's Chapter 6, The Inner Voice. How the corporation talked to itself. We're going to dive into how U.S. Steel communicated its vision, values, and culture to the very people who made it real. The workers, engineers, managers, the living cells of the corporation. 1. The Bulletin and the Voice of the Steelheart. At an unprecedented scale, U.S. Steel understood that communication couldn't just stop at notices pinned to bulletin boards or management-level meetings. They needed a channel to speak to each individual so that everyone could feel like part of that vast whole. And that's where internal magazines like the Bulletin came into play. Picture this. It's a late afternoon at the end of a long, hard shift in the mill. A worker goes home, sits down, and opens the latest issue of the Bulletin. This isn't just any newspaper. It's the heartbeat of the company. A place where stories of innovation, of work ethic, of workers' faces and lives from all over the system are told. The Bulletin reported news from different plants, introduced new inventions, shared production successes, and even featured everyday stories about workers' families. To me, that's genuinely fascinating. It turned a faceless corporation into a community with recognizable faces and stories. The Bulletin didn't just deliver information. It built a sense of belonging, an invisible thread connecting hundreds of thousands of people. It was proof that U.S. Steel cared not only about output and profit, but about the people who made those things possible. It became a place to express pride, solidarity, and faith in a shared purpose. It helped each worker see themselves not just as a cog in a massive machine, but as a valued member of a larger family. 2. Internal communication campaigns. Safety comes first. In the harsh environment of the steel industry workplace, safety wasn't just a rule, it was a moral mission. U.S. Steel was a pioneer in internal communication around safety and productivity, with a level of intensity and creativity that was remarkable for its time. Think about it. How do you get the message safety comes first across to hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom may not have had much formal education and who face potential danger every single day? U.S. Steel did it through a wide range of strong, continuous communication campaigns. From colorful posters hung all over the mills with clear, easy-to-understand illustrations to short pre-shift meetings where foremen reminded workers of safety rules. Simple, memorable slogans like, "Think safety first," or "Safety is." No accident became guiding principles for every action on the shop floor. The goal wasn't just to prevent accidents. It was to create a culture where safety was valued as highly as, or even more than, productivity. And this wasn't just talk. These campaigns often came with improvements in equipment procedures and reporting systems that allowed employees to directly contribute to making their own workplaces safer. Similarly, productivity campaigns were just as important. U.S. Steel inspired workers by linking their daily tasks to the development of the nation itself. Every ton of steel wasn't just a product, it was the foundation of roads, buildings, cars, the infrastructure of modern America. The message was clear: your work matters. You're contributing to something much bigger than yourself. That's a smart communication strategy, turning everyday labor into a source of national pride. 3. Inspirational leadership. The power of a unified vision. But how do you make those messages spread and sink in across hundreds of thousands of employees? Leadership played a crucial role. For a giant like U.S. Steel, inspirational leadership wasn't just about the CEO giving a big speech once in a while. It was an entire system. Great leaders like Albert H. Gary, often regarded as the chief architect of U.S. Steel, didn't only make high-level strategic decisions. They also laid down a management philosophy infused with ethics and social responsibility. He believed a corporation shouldn't exist solely to make money, but also had obligations to its employees and to society. That vision was clearly communicated from the very top down to middle management, and from there to every foreman and supervisor. The foremen in the mills weren't just supervisors. They were representatives of the company's vision, the people who directly inspired their teams. They were the bridge between corporate strategy and the realities of day-to-day work. They listened, answered questions, and most importantly, they lived out the values U.S. Steel wanted its employees to absorb: professionalism, safety, teamwork, and dedication. Keeping morale high among hundreds of thousands of people is no easy task. U.S. Steel did it by creating an environment where dedication was recognized, effort was rewarded, and people felt that their voices were heard. This strengthened trust and loyalty, two key ingredients in maintaining a strong, enduring soul. 4. Shaping the U.S. Steel identity, a symbol of America. All of these internal communication efforts, from magazines to safety campaigns to leadership, came together to create something special, a unique U.S. Steel identity within American corporate culture. Being an employee of U.S. Steel wasn't just about having a job. It was a source of pride. It meant belonging to a corporation that was building the backbone of a nation, providing the material for progress and prosperity. It meant relative security, a stable job with pay and benefits, often better than the average, especially in the early decades of the 20th century. The name U.S. Steel became associated with resilient strength and the American spirit. It was a symbol of industrialization, of the ability to turn raw materials into monumental structures. With hundreds of thousands of families depending on it, U.S. Steel built an identity based not only on its products, but also on human values and social responsibility. That's a legacy many modern companies still dream of achieving. How do you get employees not just to work for the company, but to actually live out its values? U.S. Steel showed that it's possible through a carefully built, persistent, deeply human internal communication system. They didn't just sell products to the market. They sold vision and values to the very people who created those products. So there you have it. U.S. Steel's inner voice wasn't a single sound. It was a symphony woven from the pages of the Bulletin, from safety slogans echoing through the mills, from the words of inspiring leaders, and most importantly, from the sense of belonging and pride felt by each worker. The soul of U.S. Steel communicated by creating a space where each individual felt valued, empowered, and essential to a greater mission. That didn't just help the corporation run efficiently. It created a lasting cultural legacy, a powerful lesson in how to build and sustain a strong corporate identity. In the next chapter, we'll explore a completely different facet of this soul, how U.S. Steel interacted with the outside world, with communities, and with the government. How did a corporation this large shape and get shaped by American society? Don't miss it. We've witnessed the triumphant birth of a giant, the steady footsteps and far-sighted visions that helped shape modern America. We've talked about the soul this corporation once carried within itself, pioneering spirit's social responsibility. And above all, the emblem of American industrial might. But every story has its darker notes, its painful turning points. And in this chapter 7, we dive into a period when U.S. Steel, the once undisputed titan, was forced to confront a brutal soul-piercing question. Was it losing its very identity? Chapter 7. An existential crisis. When the giant lost its way, it's like watching an old friend who once dominated everything suddenly realize he's no longer the fastest, no longer the strongest. In the latter half of the 20th century, the skies over industrial America began to dim. A vast region stretching from the East Coast to the Midwest, once the pounding heart of the nation's economy with steel mills blazing day and night, would soon earn a haunting new name, the Rust Belt. Point 1. The collapse of the American steel industry and the birth of the Rust Belt. Picture this. For decades, U.S. steel mills and their competitors operated at full throttle, producing the steel that built skyscrapers, grand bridges, and the cars that roamed every American highway. It was the pride of a nation. But then came a perfect storm-fierce competition from rising powers like Japan and Germany's soaring labor costs in the U.S., and a sluggishness in technological innovation. As they say, staying at the top too long can make you forget that the world keeps moving and others are racing to beat you. U.S. Steel, with its massive and complicated structure, became slow to adapt. Old blast furnaces, expensive, energy-hungry, and environmentally unfriendly, started to look ancient compared to the sleek electric arc furnaces used by smaller, more agile rivals. Then came oil shocks, inflation, and global economic turbulence. Steel demand plummeted while production costs skyrocketed. The American steel industry fell into a downward spiral, dragging an entire region, the Rust Belt, into deep, devastating decline. I often wonder what it must have felt like for the workers who had poured their sweat, tears, and entire lives into those mills, only to watch them fade into silence. Point 2. The mill closures and their devastating impact on communities. In a desperate attempt to survive, U.S. Steel's leadership had to make the harshest decisions in its history, closing mills across the country. And these weren't just business decisions typed into financial reports. They were heartbreaks. They were families losing their lifeline. They were once thriving towns collapsing into despair. Think about it. In cities like Youngstown, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, U.S., steel wasn't just a company. It was the town's backbone, its identity, its heartbeat. Generations, fathers, sons, grandsons worked in the same mill. The community's stability, pride, and culture were forged in the roar of the furnaces. So when that roar died, it left behind a void, economic, emotional, and spiritual. I've read stories of steelworkers who, after losing their jobs, felt they had lost their worth. Their pride vanished. Their sense of belonging disappeared. Tens of thousands were thrown into unemployment with no direction, no hope. Stores shut down. Schools emptied. Dreams dissolved. So here's the question. If the soul of U.S. Steel was its ability to create jobs and provide stability to millions, then didn't those closures tear that soul apart? Didn't they wound the very communities the company once helped build? Behind every layoff statistic lay a personal tragedy. Point 3. The struggle to reinvent and modernize. Under the pressure of globalization, but U.S. Steel didn't just sit and die. The corporation fought hard to adapt. They invested in new technologies, modernized remaining mills, and replaced aging equipment with more efficient systems. They restructured, slimmed down, and eliminated departments that no longer worked. Yet, the battle was brutal. Globalization wasn't a gentle breeze, it was a storm. Foreign companies armed with cutting-edge technology, lower production costs, and sometimes government support took over the market with alarming speed. U.S. Steel had to face a grim reality. It was no longer alone on the playing field. In one particularly telling move, U.S. Steel tried to escape the shrinking steel market by branching into oil and gas. The company bought Marathon Oil in 1982, a bold, almost desperate attempt to diversify and survive. The divisions would later split, but the acquisition itself revealed the extent to which leadership was scrambling for a lifeline. This was the moment when flexibility and innovation were truly tested. A corporation that had known nothing but steel now had to think bigger, look further, and rethink its future. Point 4. A crisis of identity. What is U.S. Steel if it's no longer number one? And here lies the heart of the existential crisis. For decades, U.S. Steel's identity was tied to greatness, pioneering spirit, leadership, and the embodiment of American strength and ambition. They were the immovable giant. But now that identity was slipping away. They had to compete, scramble, and fight for scraps of market share. So if U.S. Steel wasn't the world's steel powerhouse anymore, what was it? Did it still represent American spirit? Did it still have a soul? Or had it become just another profit-chasing machine doing whatever it had to do to survive? Even if it meant abandoning traditions it once held sacred. These questions weren't just for executives. They echoed across the hearts of every remaining employee and across the country. The pride, the legacy, the story that had once defined U.S. Steel now trembled at its very foundations. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was an existential one. It forced U.S. Steel to redefine itself, to search for a new purpose in a world utterly transformed. Could it do so without sacrificing the core values, the soul that defined it from the beginning? This period wasn't just a sad chapter in corporate history. It was a powerful lesson about change, adaptation, and the struggle to hold on to identity in a world that refuses to stand still. It showed that even the mightiest giants can falter, and sometimes rebirth requires painful sacrifice. Will U.S. Steel regain its identity, recover its soul from the ashes of the past? Or will it forever remain a shadow of what it once was, a cautionary tale of arrogance and inertia? Join me in Chapter 8, where we explore U.S. Steel's efforts in the 21st century to reshape its future, once again confronting the question of what it means for a corporation to have a soul. If you've been following the previous chapters, you'll remember we talked about a powerful U.S. Steel, a symbol of industrialization, a giant that not only built the infrastructure of a nation, but also shaped an entire work culture, an entire way of life. It was a company that seemed to have a soul as steady and solid as the steel beams it produced. But what happens when the world shifts, when foundations that once seemed unshakable begin to tremble? When a new era rises and demands something entirely different? That is exactly the question we'll explore together in Chapter 8, Rising from the Ashes, Finding the Soul Again in the 21st Century. As the 20th century came to a close and the 21st century began, U.S. Steel and the entire heavy industry sector had to face a perfect storm: intense globalization, competitive pressure. From emerging markets with lower costs, non-stop technological revolutions, and a rapidly growing environmental awareness across society. To be honest, there were times when it seemed like this giant would sink completely, like the Titanic. Old plants, outdated technologies, sluggish operating processes, all of it felt like chains holding them in the past. But if there's one thing we've learned from U.S. Steel's history, it's resilience. And this chapter isn't just about recovery. It's about a true rebirth, a transformation, in search of a new soul that fits the digital age. 1. Investing in new technology and mini-mills. Let's start with technology. For decades, the image of a steel mill was that of massive blast furnaces, rivers of glowing molten metal, and a production scale that felt almost epic. It was efficient in its time. But then, smaller, more agile competitors emerged with the mini-mill model. Imagine it like this: instead of a gigantic symphony orchestra with hundreds of musicians and complex instruments, mini-mills are like a modern rock band. Leaner, but still incredibly powerful, energetic, and able to adapt quickly to what the audience wants. U.S. Steel realized this. They couldn't keep clinging forever to what had brought them roaring success in the last century. To compete, they had to modernize, invest heavily in R&D, and learn how to think mini. What does that actually mean? It means investing in electric arc furnaces, EAFs, instead of traditional blast furnaces. EAFs can use scrap steel as their primary input, dramatically cutting carbon dioxide emissions, saving energy, and offering much more flexibility in adjusting output. It's not just a change in technology, it's a change in production mindset, from huge and slow to smart and nimble. Multi-billion-dollar investments in new modern facilities, integrating automation and artificial intelligence to optimize production processes. That's how U.S. Steel is betting on the future, instead of just trying to preserve the remnants of the past. They're rewriting their own score with fresh technological melodies. 2. Environmental commitments in green steel. Alongside technology, social pressure around environmental responsibility has become impossible to ignore. U.S. Steel, with its history tied to industrial smoke and soot, is now faced with a new demand: become part of the solution, not just part of the problem. This is no longer optional. It's a requirement for survival in the 21st century. Customers demand it, investors demand it, and most importantly, the planet demands it. So what is green steel? It's a broad concept, but it includes several major efforts. Reducing carbon emissions, transitioning to EAFs, as we mentioned, using renewable energy like wind or solar power in plants, and even investing in carbon capture technologies. Circular economy, maximizing the recycling of scrap steel, turning yesterday's waste into tomorrow's raw material. The steel industry actually has a huge advantage here, because steel is one of the few materials that can be recycled endlessly without losing quality. Efficient resource management, reducing water use, and finding ways to reuse waste heat. I have to say, when I look at U.S. Steel's carbon neutrality targets for the coming decades, I'm genuinely impressed. It's not just about regulatory compliance. It's a deep, strategic commitment to reshaping their image and role in the global economy. They're proving that an industrial soul can also be a green soul, one that cares about the environment. 3. Rebuilding corporate culture for a new generation of workers. But no matter how advanced the technology, no matter how noble the environmental goals, a company is ultimately made of people. And the workforce of the 21st century is completely different from the one that built Andrew Carnegie's first mills. The old corporate culture, with its rigid hierarchies, its obsession with output and iron discipline, no longer works if you want to attract and retain today's talent. Millennials and Gen Z aren't just looking for a stable job. They want purpose, flexibility, growth opportunities, and a work environment that's open and inclusive. U.S. Steel understands it needs to renovate its internal house. That includes diversity, equity, and inclusion. D. Creating a workplace where everyone, regardless of background, gender, or race, feels respected, has opportunities to advance, and is truly heard. Skill development, investing in upskilling and reskilling the existing workforce, especially in digital technology, automation, and data analytics. at the same time building programs to attract young engineers and tech professionals, a culture of innovation, encouraging creativity, experimentation, and a willingness to take risks, a huge shift from the traditional culture that prized stability and strict adherence to procedure. Safety and health. Still a top priority, but approached with a more modern mindset, not just preventing accidents, but caring for employees' mental health as well. This transformation isn't easy, but it's necessary. A company's soul can't survive if it can't connect with the hearts and minds of the people working for it. U.S. Steel is trying to shape a new soul, more open, more human, better aligned with modern social values. 4. Searching for a new soul fit for the digital age. And finally, the big question, what is U.S. Steel's soul in the 21st century? If its original soul was tied to being a symbol of American economic growth, of industrial might, of literally building the country with towering steel beams, then what does the new soul need to be? To me, it's a combination of everything we've just talked about. It's a soul that is relentlessly innovative, always looking to improve, never resting on old victories. Responsible, not just to shareholders, but to the environment, to communities, and to future generations. Human-centered, recognizing that the company's true core value lies in its people, engineers, workers, managers, the ones who give life to the machines and technologies. Global yet rooted, competing on the world stage, while still holding on to the core values that built its name. In the digital era, where everything is transparent and every action is scrutinized, a company can't hide its true nature. U.S. Steel's soul in the 21st century can't just be a marketing slogan. It has to be an operating philosophy, a compass guiding every decision. It's no longer just about making steel for bridges and skyscrapers. It's about producing essential materials for renewable energy, for electric vehicles, for smart infrastructure, with a deep awareness of their impact on the world. U.S. Steel has traveled a long road from the blazing blast furnaces of the dawn of industrialization through the brutal trials of globalization, and now into a dramatic rebirth in the digital age. They've shown that a giant can transform, can change to fit a world that refuses to stand still. And in that process, they are searching for and reshaping their soul. A soul no longer locked into the imagery of the past, but a living, flexible, responsible presence, ready to face the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. This isn't just a story about steel. It's a story about resilience, adaptation, and the meaning of finding purpose in a world that never stops changing. Thank you for listening. See you in our next chapter, Amazing. We've traveled a long road with U.S. Steel, from the ambitious early days of J.P. Morgan to the rise of a giant that shaped an entire era. But after the dust of time settles, after the revenue figures fade into memory, what truly remains? What kind of legacy does a massive corporation like U.S. Steel leave behind for America and for the world? Welcome to Chapter 9, An Immortal Legacy, the Mark of Steel on the World. In this chapter, we'll look not only at what U.S. Steel built out of steel, but also at what it forged and shaped in the soul of a nation. If we imagine America as a living body, steel is its skeleton, the solid spine that held it upright and allowed it to rise. And within that skeleton, the steel of U.S. Steel became the backbone of countless iconic structures, immortal monuments to human progress and ambition. Think about it. Of the towering bridges stretching across rivers linking lands once thought impossible to connect. The legendary Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, with its blazing orange-red color and slender yet resilient steel cables. Or the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, a symbol of innovation and connection that has stood firm for over a century against time and brutal weather. While not every beam of steel in these structures came from U.S. Steel, there's no denying their pioneering role and status as a major supplier shaping the steel industry behind such monumental works. Their steel wasn't just material, it was a promise of durability, of turning mankind's boldest dreams into reality. And then we have the skyscrapers, and the symbols of reaching higher, of the desire to touch the blue sky. The Empire State Building, an Art Deco masterpiece that held the title of tallest building in the world. For decades, the shimmering Chrysler Building with its unmistakable crown. When you stand at the base of these steel and glass giants, you don't just see a construction project. You see resilience, endurance, and a nation's boundless vision. U.S. Steel provided the spine, the framework, the bones that allowed brilliant architects and engineers to turn sketches on paper into towering landmarks that pierce the clouds, shaping the skylines of major cities across America, and through their influence, the world. This wasn't just economics, it was a declaration of human capability and will. But not all of U.S. Steel's legacy shines like those skyscrapers. To build such wonders required sweat, tears, and even blood from the workers. And from those grueling struggles, from the clashes between a corporation with enormous power and the faint but persistent voices of laborers, another profound legacy emerged: their impact on modern labor laws and industrial relations in America. U.S. Steel, with its unprecedented scale and power, became the focal point of the union movement. Major strikes, long legal battles, even violent conflicts forced American society to reconsider the value of labor, the right to live and work in safe, fair conditions. It wasn't that U.S. Steel graciously handed out these rights. Rather, their sheer presence and methods ignited the demand for fairness from workers. Historic battles with unions, such as the United Steelworkers, gradually shaped the legal and social framework for employer-employee relations. Collective bargaining, the right to unionize minimum working conditions, fair wages, things we now take for granted, were forged in no small part from the trials between giant industrial corporations like U.S. Steel and the people whose hands kept their furnaces burning. They may have been adversaries, but they were also the catalyst for a new era of labor rights, not only in the U.S., but around the world. That is a legacy of social justice, of recognizing human dignity, something no material achievement can rival. And believe it or not, U.S. Steel's legacy even seeps into the hidden corners, the deeper layers of American culture. The image of the steelworker has become a powerful symbol in film and literature. Think of those familiar images: the broad-shouldered man in a grease-stained blue shirt, face smudged with soot, and sweat eyes filled with grit and determination. These are the people who worked in the blistering heat of blast furnaces, where molten metal glowed like the sun. They hauled and forged heavy steel beams. They weren't just laborers, they were silent heroes, the industrial heart of America. In classic films and gritty novels, steelworkers are often portrayed with raw realism, survival struggles, the deep brotherhood, the desire for a better life for their families. They represent the blue-collar working class, the American dream not found only on Wall Street, but in factories and mills. U.S. Steel, with hundreds of thousands of workers, supplied the raw material, not just steel but stories, lives. Inspiration for filmmakers and writers to create unforgettable works that shape the cultural memory and identity of a nation. It's an invisible yet powerful legacy woven into America's soul. Finally, U.S. Steel leaves behind a profound lesson on the rise and fall of an industrial giant. From the heights of near-absolute power controlling much of the world's steel production, to confronting the harsh challenges of global competition, new technologies, and shifting business environments. U.S. Steel's story is a powerful reminder that no empire is immortal, no dominance eternal. Even the mightiest corporations face obsolescence if they fail to innovate, fail to respond to rising competitors, or ignore society's growing expectations for environmental and social responsibility. The rise of Japanese, German, and later Chinese steel, coupled with economic crises, forced U.S. Steel to downsize shutter plants and endure painful restructuring. The lesson here isn't just for steel companies. It's for every business: flexibility, innovation, care for people. And the environment and long-term vision are vital for survival. U.S. Steel is living proof that no matter how grand the beginning or how powerful the empire, complacency or slow adaptation can shake even the largest giant. So there you have it. U.S. Steel's legacy isn't just in steel beams or profit numbers. It lives in the bridges we cross every day, in the skyscrapers reaching for the sky, in the labor protections we consider common sense. It lives in the image of the steadfast steelworker etched into our minds, and in the lesson of humility before the relentless forces of change. U.S. Steel may no longer be the corporation with a soul that J.P. Morgan once envisioned, but its imprint on the world, both physical and spiritual, is undeniable. And perhaps it is that very complexity, that greatness intertwined with flaws, that creates a truly immortal legacy. I hope the previous chapters about United States Steel have given you plenty of interesting perspectives, not just about a massive corporation, but also about the economic history of America. We've walked through highs and lows, bold decisions, and even lessons about humanity in a turbulent era. Today we turn a new page, one that feels like both a conclusion and a glimpse into the future. After living alongside U.S. Steel through many decades, the big question I'd like us to reflect on together is, can every business, whether large or small, young or old, truly possess a soul the way this book suggests U.S. Steel once did? And if so, what lessons can modern companies take from that? Corporate soul, a concept that sounds abstract, maybe even overly romantic in the pragmatic world of business. When we talk about a soul, what comes to mind? Massive profits, a recognizable brand, beautiful value statements printed on office walls. From my perspective, and perhaps also from the view of the author of the book on U.S. Steel, the soul of a business isn't something you measure in financial terms. It's the sum of purpose, core values, and the way people inside the organization interact with one another and with the outside world. It's the personality, the identity that people immediately feel the moment the company's name is mentioned. Think back to U.S. Steel in its earliest days. It wasn't just a steel company. It was creation. It was American spirit. It was millions of jobs. It was bridges and skyscrapers. Its soul was defined partly by that mission, partly by how it treated its workers, even if imperfectly there was always some level of effort, and partly by its commitment to national development. Profit was the blood that kept the body alive, but the soul was the why behind its existence, not just the what. I believe the soul of a business is shaped by all three elements, but with a very clear hierarchy. Core values are the backbone, the compass for every action. People, from founders and leaders to every employee, are the heart and mind, the ones who bring those values to life every day. And profit, as I said, is the inevitable and necessary result that sustains the business. But it is not the ultimate purpose of the soul. A company that chases only profit lacks depth and true internal cohesion. So how can companies today, in a world full of volatility and fierce competition, build and nurture this soul? This is the fun part because it connects history to the present. First, they need a clear and powerful purpose. Not just make money or sell good products. A company with a soul knows why it exists, what impact it wants to make in the world. Think of Patagonia and its commitment to protecting the environment, or Tom's with its one-for-one model. When the purpose is clear, it becomes a lighthouse that attracts people who share the same vision. Second, core values must be lived, not just written. Many companies have grand values printed on posters or displayed on websites, but how many actually embody them? A business with a soul reflects its values in every decision, from hiring and training to crisis management and customer service. It must be ingrained into the culture, becoming instinctive. Third, a people-centered culture. When employees feel valued, empowered, heard, and given opportunities to grow, they don't just work with their minds, they work with their hearts. They become ambassadors, carriers of the company's soul to customers and the community. U.S. Steel struggled with labor issues at times, but in its best moments it understood that caring for workers, however imperfectly, was a vital part of that identity. And finally, social and community responsibility is indispensable. A company with a soul doesn't think only of shareholders, but also stakeholders, customers, suppliers, and especially the communities where it operates. Today we see this more clearly in the rise of ESG, environmental social governance. No soul appears out of nowhere, and no soul sustains itself without care. This is where the role of leadership becomes absolutely essential. Leaders are the architects, guardians, and living mirrors of that soul. They must be the first to embody the company's values. If leadership preaches transparency but lacks honesty, or preaches innovation but resists change, then those values are nothing more than empty slogans. Leaders must have vision to see beyond short-term financial gains. They must have courage to make difficult decisions that prioritize purpose and values over immediate pressures. They must have empathy to understand and connect with people within the organization, creating a safe environment where individuals can express themselves and contribute fully. Think of Andrew Carnegie or J.P. Morgan as they built U.S. Steel. Controversial methods aside, they had a vision far larger than simply making money, building an industrial empire, a foundation for American strength. That vision, coupled with their personalities and decisions, helped shape the early soul of U.S. Steel. What we're discussing here isn't new, nor is it a temporary trend. It has evolved into an entire philosophy known as conscious capitalism. This philosophy believes that businesses can and should create value for all stakeholders, not just shareholders, employees, customers, suppliers, and communities, while still generating sustainable profits. It's not charity, it's smarter, more sustainable business. Is this the future of business? I believe it is. First, today's consumers are smarter and more ethical. They don't just buy a product, they buy a story, values, and they support responsible companies. Second, recruiting and retaining talent. Younger generations want meaning in their work. They want to work for companies with a clear purpose, healthy culture, and positive societal impact. Third, resilience and adaptability. Companies with strong souls, strong stakeholder relationships, usually endure crises better and adapt more effectively to market changes. Of course, this path isn't easy. There will be pressure for short-term profits, temptations of greenwashing, or hollow virtue signaling without real action. But in the long run, the companies that truly nurture their soul will be the winners. They won't just build successful businesses, they'll leave meaningful legacies for future generations. So yes, my answer to whether every business can have a soul is absolutely, and it should. It requires courage, consistency, and a vision that goes beyond the balance sheet. U.S. Steel may be a story from the past, but its lessons about purpose, people, and values remain just as relevant today. When a business has a soul, it's not just a money-making machine. It becomes a living entity, meaningful, long-lasting, and most importantly, inspiring. Thank you for joining me on this journey through this valuable book. Share your thoughts about corporate soul in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters. Welcome to a journey of exploration, an adventure that I believe will not only change the way you look at work, but also the way you live your life. We're talking about the soul of an organization, the soul of the work you do, and the soul within yourself. In the previous video, we dove deep into the unbelievable story of United States Steel, a corporation with a soul. A massive steel empire that, despite seeming dry and mechanical, carried within it a profound meaning, a very real soul. It forces us to ask, if a heavy industrial giant like U.S. Steel can have a soul, then how could our own work, our own organizations, not have one? I believe they can. And not only can, but must. Because when work has a soul, it's no longer just a dry list of tasks. It becomes part of something larger, something meaningful. It's what pushes us to get up every morning with energy, with joy, and with a sense of fulfillment. And today, I want to walk with you through a roadmap. A 7-day action plan to awaken that soul right inside your own workplace. This is not a magical formula, but a journey of lived experience, a personal reflection that any one of us can begin starting right now. Are you ready? Let's dive into each day together. Day 1-2. Observe and listen to the heartbeat of your organization. What are the real values? Imagine you're an explorer who has just set foot in a new land, or a doctor listening carefully to a patient's heartbeat. During these first 2 days, your role is that of a careful observer and listener. What's the goal? Not to judge, but to feel the true heartbeat of your organization. We often see core values framed beautifully on the wall or highlighted on the company website, right? Integrity, innovation, customer first, collaboration. Sounds amazing, but have you ever asked yourself, do these values really show up in everyday actions and decisions? This is the time to use your eyes and your ears. Observe meetings. Who gets praised? What gets prioritized in discussions? What topics are pushed aside? Do leaders speak and act consistently with the values they promote? Listen to informal conversations. In the pantry, at the coffee area, even in the elevator. What are your colleagues talking about? What excites them? What do they complain about? This is often where the organization's true inner voice comes out. Pay attention to decisions. When a big decision is made, about strategy staffing or even something like budget allocation for a project, ask yourself, does this decision truly reflect the stated values? Or is it driven by something else, like short-term profit or the comfort of a few individuals? Feel the interaction culture. How do people talk to one another? How do they handle conflict? Do they support each other or compete harshly? These are key signals of which values are truly alive and honored. Write down your observations, even just as a few bullet points. Don't rush to conclusions. Just gather information like an explorer, slowly sketching a map of unknown territory. These 2 days are for you to feel your organization, to go beyond the outer shell, and start to recognize what's really running underneath. You might be surprised by what you discover. Day 3-4. Explore the history and DNA of your workplace, the stories that built it. Once you've started to sense the current heartbeat, we take a step back and look into the past. Just like when you want to truly understand a close friend, you'd learn about their childhood, their family, and the experiences that shaped them. An organization is no different. It has a DNA, a history that has woven the fabric of its present. Over these 2 days, your task is to become an unofficial historian, an archaeologist digging for stories. Read about the company's history. Many large companies have official histories, books, or public materials about their journey. Old news articles, early press releases. What drove the founders? What hardships did they overcome? Look for stories. Every organization has its legends that get told and retold. Stories about a tough project that succeeded, about an employee who beat the odds, about a turning point decision that saved the company. These aren't just entertaining tales. They're culture bricks, silent compasses for which values are truly honored. Ask long-tenured colleagues about the stories they remember most about what has made them stay. Understand the key milestones. How has the company changed over time? Were there moments when it had to redefine itself? How did those transformations happen, and what legacy have they left behind? Analyze symbols and rituals. Why is the logo the way it is? Why do certain annual events exist? Why are things done in a particular way? Sometimes the soul of an organization hides in the smallest symbolic details. As you connect scattered anecdotes and historical events, a clearer picture of your organization's soul will begin to emerge. You'll start to understand why things are the way they are today, and whether the original values are still intact or have been reshaped over time. This understanding will become a solid foundation for your next steps. Day 5. Connect with the heart. Talk to a long-tenured colleague about shared values. After days of observing from the outside and learning from the past, it's time to turn toward the living heart of the organization. That heart is the people who have stayed, who've poured a large part of their lives into this place. They are the keepers of the culture, living embodiments of the history, and a bridge between past and present. Your task for Day 5, invite a long-tenured colleague for coffee lunch or simply a genuine conversation. Who should you choose? Look for someone you feel a natural connection with, someone you admire for their dedication or deep understanding of the company. They don't have to be a boss or senior executive. Sometimes an accountant who has been around for 20 years or a security guard who's watched everything change can offer the most valuable insights. How to approach them. Be sincere. Say something like, "I really want to understand this company on a deeper level. What makes it special? I really admire your commitment and would love to hear your stories and experiences." Good open-ended questions might be, what has kept you here for so long? Over all your years here, what moment made you feel the proudest? Is there something about this company you feel has never changed, no matter how much the world shifts? If there's one thing you'd want younger people like us to understand about the spirit of this company, what would it be? In the toughest times, what kept everyone together? Listen without judgment, with an open heart. You won't just hear stories, you'll feel emotions, convictions, and values that have sunk deep into the heart of that person, and through them, into the heart of the organization. This conversation might become a turning point, a spark in your journey to find the soul in your work. You'll realize that no matter how dry a job might look from the outside, at the end of the day, it's always the story of people. Day 6-7, leave your own mark. Propose a small human-centered improvement. We've spent days observing, studying history, and connecting with the heart of the organization. Now it's time to shift from observer to creator, from listener to contributor. This is your chance not only to find the soul, but to help nurture it and make it shine brighter. During these last 2 days, focus on proposing one small human-centered improvement based on everything you've learned. Identify one small area to improve. Based on your observations from days phase 1 and 2, or to the history from days 3-4 and your Day 5 conversation, did you notice a small pain point or a missing piece in the human or spiritual side of the organization? Maybe there's a work process that disconnects people. Maybe there's no open channel for employees to share ideas. Maybe there's little recognition for small but meaningful contributions. Or maybe the workspace feels too cold, lacking warmth and humanity. Think of a human solution. Instead of proposing a big technical system or a complex process change, think of something simple that strengthens connection, improves morale, or nurtures core values. For example, if people rarely talk to each other, suggest a 15-minute weekly random coffee break, mixing people from different teams. If recognition is lacking, propose a monthly kindness wall or Act of the Month board. If the space feels stiff, propose a small green corner with plants everyone helps care for. If inspiring stories are forgotten, propose a Stories of Us section in the internal newsletter. Present your idea positively. Don't come in with, "Here's the problem, and here's my fix." Instead, try. After observing, learning, and talking to people, I've noticed a small opportunity for us to make this place even better, more human. Start where you have influence. If you can't propose something company-wide, start with your team or department. Even a small ripple can spread. Leaving your mark isn't just about improving the organization. It's about you actively shaping the kind of workplace you truly want to belong to. When you act with the intention of nurturing the collective soul, you are also nurturing your own. You'll feel a deeper sense of ownership, pride, and meaning in your daily work. And that brings us to the end of this 7-day action plan to awaken the soul in your work. This isn't a magic formula that will change everything overnight. It's a beginning, a journey of discovery, an invitation for you to become the architect of your own meaning and purpose. Remember, the soul of an organization is not something tangible you can touch. It's the sum of values that are lived, stories that are told, connections that are created, and the human marks each of us chooses to leave behind. U.S. Steel, a massive corporation, showed us that even in the harshest environments, a soul can exist and grow. So what reason do you have not to begin your own journey of finding and nurturing that soul in your work? Start with day 1 today. And please share with me what you discover and feel along the way in the comments below. I'm really looking forward to hearing your stories. All right, so we've gone on a truly captivating journey together, diving deep into the steel soul of United States Steel. A story not just about iron and steel, about blazing blast furnaces, but about aspirations, trials, and the true nature of a great organization. We've walked through its highs and lows, its historic decisions, and the kind of hard-earned lessons that no business school could ever fully teach you. And now, my friends, it's time for us to distill all of that. To extract the essence, the drops of liquid gold that U.S. Steel has left behind for future generations. If I had to wrap everything we've talked about and reflected on into 3 core messages, 3 golden lessons that I believe can light the way for anyone. Whether you're running a small business, leading a massive corporation, or simply searching for meaning in your work and your life, then these would be it. Let's walk through each lesson together, and I promise you'll see just how powerful and practical they really are. Golden lesson number 1: a great organization is built on clear principles and values, not just on profit. It sounds obvious, doesn't it? But let's be honest with each other. In today's frantic business world, how many times have we watched companies throw themselves into the profit race at all costs, slashing costs to the point where quality suffers, cutting back on employee benefits, or even getting tangled in ethical scandals just because of revenue pressure? U.S. Steel, right from the very beginning, showed us another path. It wasn't just a collection of mills or mines or massive assets. It was an idea. It was the legacy of Andrew Carnegie, who believed that a company isn't only responsible to its shareholders, but also to its employees, its community, and even its nation. And here's the really interesting part. When people talk about profit, they usually mean the numbers at the end of the quarter or the end of the year. But U.S. Steel proved that sustainable, truly great profit comes from a solid foundation of principles. From a commitment to product quality to worker safety, even if that costs more in the short term. From investments in housing schools, hospitals for the communities around its plants, creating a better living environment for the people who spilled sweat and blood to build its steel empire. I once read a great line: "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." Meaning, you can have the best business strategy in the world, but if your culture, your core values and principles, isn't solid, everything will eventually collapse. U.S. Steel laid the very first bricks of its soul with values that could not be shaken: reliability, social responsibility, and above all, a vision that reached far beyond the borders of a financial report. When an organization is built on clear principles, it has a compass. That compass doesn't just point toward money. It points toward what's right. And sometimes doing the right thing is actually the longest-lasting, most sustainable way to create profit and a real legacy. Ask yourself, is your organization, or even your own life, built on clear principles, or just on numbers dancing across a screen? Golden lesson number 2. The soul of a company lies in its people, its employees, its customers, and the community it serves. If the first lesson is about the foundation, then this second one is the heart, the breath of that steel soul. Steel is tough, cold, and lifeless. But a steel company is not. A steel company, and any company, is made of living, breathing human beings. In U.S. Steel's story, we see this very clearly. Who turned raw iron ore into solid beams that built America? Hard-working workers, brilliant engineers, dedicated managers. They're not just labor resources. They're family citizens, people with dreams, fears, and deep pride when they see their work shaping the world. When a company truly cares about them, through benefits, working conditions, or even just basic respect, then the soul of that company becomes more vivid and powerful. An employee who feels valued doesn't just work with their hands. They work with their heart and mind. They become your best ambassadors, whether they're on the production line or sitting behind a desk. And it's not just employees. That soul also flows out to customers. U.S. Steel built rock-solid trust with its customers because it didn't just sell steel. It sold a commitment to quality, reliability, and long-term partnership. Customers don't just buy products. They buy solutions, they buy trust. And that trust is built through human-to-human interactions. And then there's the community. I still remember the parts about U.S. Steel investing in towns building infrastructure. That wasn't just charity. It was a deep understanding that a company can't thrive if it's surrounded by a struggling community. The relationship between a company and its community is like a tree and its soil. If the soil is healthy, the tree can flourish. So this lesson reminds us, never forget the value of the human element. In every business decision, try looking through the lens of the people who will be affected, your employees, your customers, and the community you're in. Because in the end, the soul of everything lies there, in the relationships we build. Golden lesson number 3. Even giants must constantly adapt and reinvent their soul in order to survive and grow. This is the lesson I think is the most important for our time. When we talk about the steel soul of U.S. Steel, we often imagine something eternal, unshakable, right? It's steel, after all, strong, durable. But U.S. Steel's history shows us the opposite. Even a great empire like that had to face wave after wave of challenge, technological revolutions, fierce competition from Japanese and European, steel global economic upheavals, union battles, and environmental pressure. If U.S. Steel had clung only to what made it successful in the past, if it hadn't been willing to change its steel soul, might have melted away long ago. Reinventing the soul doesn't mean betraying its essence. It means holding tight to core principles. Lesson 1, honoring people. Lesson 2, while staying open to what's new, constantly learning and innovating. That takes tremendous courage. It requires acknowledging your weaknesses, admitting that yesterday's success formulas can become tomorrow's dead weight. Reinventing the soul might mean investing in new technologies, changing production processes, restructuring the organization, or even redefining your role in a changing economy. When U.S. Steel went through its harsh periods, it was forced to look in the mirror and ask, are we still serving our original purpose? Is the way we operate still effective? Has our soul been covered by the dust of complacency and stagnation? That makes me think about our own lives, our own careers. The world never stops spinning, and if we don't learn to adapt, if we're not willing to reinvent our own soul. By learning new skills, changing our mindset, or even seeking a different life purpose, we'll be left behind. Nothing is permanent except change, and only those who are willing to change deliberately, holding on to their identity while still moving forward, can keep writing their story. So there you have it, 3 golden lessons from the steel soul of United States Steel. First, build on principles and values, not just profit. Second, the soul of a company lives in its people, employees, customers, communities. And third, adapt and renew the soul to survive and grow. We may not be running a giant steel corporation, but these lessons are universal and timeless. They remind us of the importance of authenticity, compassion, and a spirit of continual learning. They remind us that no matter who you are or what you do, building a strong, resilient, and ever-evolving soul is the key to a truly meaningful life and career. I hope these reflections have given you a new perspective, a new source of inspiration. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey. See you in the next videos.